It is a strict duty for every priest who wants to remain Catholic to separate himself from this Conciliar Church for as long as it does not rediscover the truths of the Church magisterium and of the Catholic faith. So,
if you don't have the whole picture, you think they are crazy to make an agreement now. And so it will be quite work, and I think it will take time to be able to bring the faithful to realize this new phase in the history of the Church, that is this new reality.
Bishop Follet is not really looking for an agreement. Rome is proposing a regularization of the society.
all right, so this is a conference. We're going to talk about the Society of St. Pius X and the crisis in the society, and why we have to be in the resistance and why we can't be in the society anymore. That's what was the requested topic, or something similar to that. So that's what it's about. So as you know, the society was founded because of the crisis in the church. The crisis in the church was recognized by St. Pius X, that all these modernists were infiltrating the church, and he condemned the modernists, and he brought out the anti-modernist oath, that all the priests and bishops and university professors and seminary professors and others who gave instruction and taught were required to take the anti-modernist oath, that they would not be modernists, and the bishops were instructed to root out any modernists in the seminaries and throw them out and say they could not be in the seminary and teach. That was what the Pope did. But the modernism went underground. It stayed around, and the modernists were denounced, but they did not go away. They did not leave, and they stayed in the church. And they started coming back in the 40s and the 50s to infiltrate the church and to prepare for the council. And then they elected a pope with the idea that he would call a council. And that was, his name was Roncalli. He took the name of John the 23rd, Pope John the 23rd, and he did call the council. And then he died. And normally, when a pope who calls a council dies, the council ends. But the Second Vatican Council didn't end, so Paul VI, his successor, took it over. And the council was taken over by the modernists from the beginning. From day one, they took over and ran the council, and they were determined to corrupt the church with the council. So in reaction to this, some people became traditionals. They became traditional. They said, we're not having this. We're not accepting these changes. We're not accepting this modernism. We're not accepting these errors. And the traditional movement started. And then some young men went and recruited Archbishop Lefebvre to find a place for them to learn to become priests that was still Catholic, so they could be Catholic priests and not modernist priests. And eventually he was obliged, because he couldn't find any place else, he was obliged to start a seminary, and he started the Society of St. Pius X. So the purpose of the Society of St. Pius X was to fight against the corruption within the church, the internal enemies of the church, the modernists within the church. So our purpose was not to fight against the Muslims or the Protestants or the Jews or the Buddhists or the external enemies of the church, but primarily the internal enemies of the church, the ones within. They were the ones that we were set up in reaction to preserve the faith despite these internal enemies. And that was the whole purpose of the society, especially to prepare Catholic priests that were immune from the corruption that was in the church, that did not fall into the corruption, that kept the Catholic faith and refused to have anything to do with the modernists. And that's the way the society was. There were many splits in the society. Many people went off to the right or the left. They left the society and went to various ways. One of the worst splits was in 1988. In 1988, Archbishop Lefebvre was getting old, and Rome was refusing to give him permission to consecrate a bishop to replace him, a good Catholic man to be a bishop, to replace him. And he realized that they were just, Cardinal Ratzinger was just stringing him along and trying to make him compromise in some way, or probably hoping he would just die without a bishop. And so Cardinal Ratzinger was stringing him around. He realized that finally, and decided on his own to consecrate bishops. And then he ended up consecrating 4 bishops, as you know, in 1988. And in reaction to that, the Benedictines, Dom Gerard, left him and said, "No, we can't be with you." And he made a deal with Rome and went with the Romanists, and he ended up being the monk monastery became corrupt. And now I think they say the new mass sometimes. They are under the conciliar bishop, and they became conciliarists. And the daughter monastery of Labarue is in Brazil. And Dom Thomas Aquinas said, "No, I'm not going to go that way. We're going to stay with Archbishop Lefebvre and not join that." So there was a split there in the Benedictines, and some remained Catholic and some became conciliar. And the ones in Brazil were the ones that remained Catholic. And then some priests left and went to John Paul II and started the Society of St. Peter. They were traitors. That's what Archbishop Lefebvre called them. They were traitors, the ones that founded that society. And we always avoided going anywhere near it. And we were told to have nothing to do with the Society of St. Peter because they're traitors. They've gone over to the conciliarists and joined the enemy. And that's what a traitor is, one that goes over to the enemy. And the enemy of us was the internal enemy, was the modernists in Rome and the conciliarists in Rome. And so that was the Society of St. Peter. And then Archbishop Lefebvre went and continued on, and then finally he died in 1991. So that was, he died. But Father Schmidberger then was the Superior General. And under Father Schmidberger, the society appeared to be and seemed to be taking the same course as it had always been on, that he did not divert the course, he did not change anything. At that time, he was when he was Superior General, he kept on, I forget what year he ended up being, stopped being Superior General. What year was that?
94.
Oh yeah, 94. Yeah, okay, all right, so very good. All right, so he stopped being Superior General then. When he was Superior General, it seemed to be going on the same way as usual. And then Bishop Follet took over as Superior General. And after he took over, well, we don't know, at the time nobody knew what was happening. But in 1997, they brought in this organization called GREC. GREC is a set of initials, G-R-E-C, for something in French. Whatever it stands for, I don't know. But his purpose was to find, it was set up by the wife of a dead politician. She was influential in it because he had died. He wanted to do something. And the plan was to find a political solution to the problem of the Society of St. Pius X. The Society of St. Pius X was now considered to be a problem, and to find a political solution, find a way to integrate the Society of St. Pius X into the Conciliar Church, even though we didn't have the same doctrine. So it wasn't looking for a doctrinal solution, it was looking for a political solution, a way to work together, that we could work together with the Romans, even though we had different ideas and different thoughts, that we could see where we could find some common ground and work together. The church has done such things with the Lutherans. They made a Catholic Lutheran accord where they say, well, what do we agree on? Well, you think there's one God, and we think there's one God, so yeah, we think the same way. And so they made an agreement with the Lutherans to work with them, even though they have a few differences in doctrine and ideas in doctrine, and so they managed to do that. So they thought they could do the same thing with the Society of St. Pius X. And so this was all behind the scenes. It was secret meetings. They were never published. The minutes of the meetings were never published. But a priest of the society was always there, representing Bishop Follet. So Bishop Follet was always represented from 1997 at these talks. And it's probably these talks that led to, in 2000, Cardinal Hoyos invited, 2000 we had a pilgrimage to Rome. The society organized a big pilgrimage to Rome, and they invited everybody to come from all over the world, well publicized. People came from all over the world, and there were probably about 5,000 people there. A large number of the priests of the Society of St. Pius X were there. All 4 bishops of the Society of St. Pius X were there. The nuns were there, the Oblate sisters, some of the religious orders were all represented and were in tradition. The whole thing of tradition was all brought there, and Bishop Follet and the superiors encouraged everybody to go to Rome for this pilgrimage. And it was a big pilgrimage, and it seemed pretty good. It appeared to be pretty good, and it was to impress the Romans with our strength. That was the idea, to impress the Romans as well, to show how much power we have. And they were open to us, letting us say Mass in their places, letting us visit everywhere, and not closing any doors. So it was all arranged that they wouldn't close any doors to us. And the pilgrimage went along fine as scheduled. And had this. And then spontaneously, or allegedly spontaneously, Cardinal Hoyos invited Bishop Follet and the other 3 bishops to dinner. Maybe it was planned ahead, and probably Grec had something to do with it, but it was given off as being a spontaneous invitation. And there's a is it called an axiom, or a little moral law or something? When you sup with the devil, you use a long spoon. That's what they say. If you sup with the devil, make sure you got a very long spoon so you don't get very close to him. So if you want him at the other end of the table, and you want to be far from him. But they didn't, so they had a nice dinner, many courses. I think it was over a 2-hour dinner or something like this. Very good, and lots of good conversation. They found out, well, Cardinal Hoyos is a very good man. He's very, very pleasant. He's a good host. Very kind to him. And then they resumed talks with him, and started trying to organize something inside for the society. And then I think he was at the time in charge of the Ecclesia Dei Commission, which was in charge of all the traditional organizations, or the so-called traditional organizations within the Conciliar Church. So the Society of St. Peter. The Ecclesia Dei Commission was especially set up for the Society of St. Peter when it was formed in 1988. But after that, it took in all the other organizations that were saying the traditional Mass or using some kind of traditional liturgy, and still within the Conciliar Church. So now we're having talks with Cardinal Hoyos, and companionship with Cardinal Hoyos. And this is bringing us together with the Romans. So that was the society. So we were under, at the time, when the Archbishop consecrated the bishops, we said it was not a schismatic act. It was not an illegal act. It was a necessary act because of the state of necessity within the church, because the church was corrupt in its hierarchy and its magisterium. It was corrupt. It was teaching errors since the Vatican Council, and so we had the state of necessity, and we could not be under the Roman hierarchy. And so the state of necessity, we separated ourselves from the enemies of the church who were within the church, and we separated ourselves from what is called the Conciliar Church, which was the name that they gave it themselves, because it was they knew they changed the church after the council, and so they named it after the council, the Conciliar Church. So Archbishop Lefebvre said, and he wrote this in his book, Spiritual Journey, which is a very good book, of course. It is a strict duty for every priest who wants to remain Catholic to separate himself from this Conciliar Church for as long as it does not rediscover the truths of the Church magisterium and of the Catholic faith. So we have to separate ourselves from the Conciliar Church if we want to remain Catholic. That's what the Archbishop wrote in his book, and that has not changed anything. So that still has not changed because they're still not Catholic. They haven't rediscovered the Catholic faith, the Conciliar Church. And so if we want to remain Catholic, we have to separate ourselves from them. Now why do we have to separate ourselves to remain Catholic? Because it's contagious. Modernism is contagious. It's like a virus. And if you stay around somebody that has it, then you get it. And then you become a modernist. And this has happened to many of the priests in the society who were anti-modernist and now are modernist. And so modernism is rampant in the society of St. Pius X now because they did not separate themselves from the Conciliar Church. They wanted to be with the Church. And so because of this state of necessity, we had supplied jurisdiction for the sacraments. We didn't have a jurisdiction. And Bishop Follet didn't have any jurisdiction. Bishop Williamson didn't have any jurisdiction. Bishop de Galaretta didn't have any jurisdiction. Bishop Tissier de Malloret did not have any jurisdiction. Archbishop Lefebvre made that clear in 1988, the day he consecrated them, that he was not giving them any jurisdiction because he could not do that. And that's why the church was not schismatic. So they were there, they were consecrated to be auxiliary bishops of the Society of St. Pius X, and to do especially confirmations and ordinations in the seminaries of the society, to do ordinations and to do perform the sacrament of confirmation. That's why they were consecrated bishop. They weren't consecrated bishop to go out and teach, to go out and teach with any the authority of the church, to teach as if they had jurisdiction. They were still supposed to teach, of course. That's obligatory upon a bishop, but they weren't to teach with authority because they had no authority. And, so that's what happened. But now, since then, the society has changed, and they want to make an agreement without the church converting, without the church returning, the Conciliar Church returning to tradition, returning to the faith. They want to have some kind of, like I said, a political agreement where we work together, agreement where they're recognized, and they want to be recognized. They don't necessarily want an official agreement, and probably there never will be an official written agreement. So they say there's no agreement, but that's not true. That's a lie when they say there's no agreement, because they made many agreements. And so they rejected supplied jurisdiction. Supplied jurisdiction, we said we got jurisdiction directly from the church on a per case basis. If somebody wants to go to confession, the priest gets jurisdiction to hear their confession because there's a need for a confession. Somebody wants to get married, well, we didn't have jurisdiction. We never claimed jurisdiction for marriages, but you don't need jurisdiction for marriage because the priest actually does not minister the marriage. Who ministers the marriage? Who's married here? Who's the minister of the marriage? Yes, the bride and groom, yeah, man and woman. So they are the ministers. So they can get married without a priest in the state of necessity. If there's a long time before they can find a priest. And so we always made them sign a paper. Said, I'm getting married lawfully and validly without the parish priest because I don't want to get corrupted by bad doctrine, bad teaching, and the wrong teaching on marriage, especially with regard to children and contraception and these other evils that are accepted in the new church. And so we wanted to, we have the people signed a paper that they were getting married without the official priest, but the law says if there's another priest available, he can and should assist at the wedding. And so it was this priest of the society then that was available, and he would assist at the wedding. But he would not be the official assistant. The marriage would be valid. So the law was if you had to go a long time without marriage. And a long time was considered to be 30 days. If you had to wait a long time before you could find a valid minister. So 30 days is a long time to wait if you want to get married. And so that was what the papers, we had people sign a paper to that effect. And so we had the marriages were lawful and valid according to all the laws of the church. And the confessions were all valid because the priests were all lawfully ordained priests and they had jurisdiction from the church. And supplied jurisdiction supplies for every sin, for every single sin, because the jurisdiction comes directly from the Pope, not from the Pope, from the church to the priest. And so there's no chain of command. There's no chain. Ordinary jurisdiction in the church comes from the bishop. The bishop is called the ordinary of the diocese, and that's because his work is to put things in order in his diocese. So if there's an infidel, he has to put him in order by converting him. So he's got to convert the infidels in his diocese, he's got to convert the heretics in his diocese, and he's got to see that people practice the faith in the diocese. That's the work of the ordinary, to put everything in order in the diocese, so it's a place where Christ is truly king. That's in the Catholic Church. That's what the ordinary is supposed to do. So he has ordinary jurisdiction. Jurisdiction means you can make laws, you can speak the law, you can make the law, you can make judgments, you have authority to judge things and all this. And so he appoints, he appoints a parish priest or somebody and gives him jurisdiction over a parish. And then he might appoint a curate, and the curate would get jurisdiction also in the parish from below the parish priest level. So that would be the hierarchy in the diocese, and that'd be ordinary jurisdiction that a priest would have, and he'd be authorized. It used to be you could only hear confessions of people from your diocese, because the bishop could only give you jurisdiction for the people that were under his control, and only the people under his control were the ones in his diocese. So a priest could only hear the confessions of the people in his diocese, so he couldn't hear strangers' confessions or anything like that. So they had to get people in the diocese, and if he went somewhere else, well, he didn't have jurisdiction for confessions. You'd have to ask the parish priest or the bishop to if he could hear confessions in that place, and that's what he had to do. So that was ordinary jurisdiction, but we didn't have ordinary jurisdiction, and so with that ordinary jurisdiction, there could be a break in the chain. The Pope or the bishop could reserve a sin. He said, this particular sin, you don't have jurisdiction. And he would keep it to himself. So somebody who confessed that sin, the priest would have to say, sorry, I can't give you absolution for that sin. You have to go to the bishop. Or else I have to go make a recourse to the bishop and see if he'll give me special permission for this particular case to hear that confession. So that's what happened with ordinary jurisdiction. There were reserved sins. So some sins were reserved to Rome, some to the diocese, and some maybe to even the parish priest could reserve a sin. So if he knew one of the boys in the parish threw a rock through his window because they were angry at him, well, he could reserve that sin and tell the curate, if anybody confesses that sin, you have to tell him he's got to come to me for absolution. You can't give him absolution. He's got to come to me. I'm the parish priest. Since the parish priest could do that, he could reserve that sin to himself. See? And say, so that boy would have to come to him if he wanted absolution. So that's what they could do. But probably they wouldn't do it in cases like that very often. But there were officially reserved sins in that case. So with supplied jurisdiction, though, there's no reserved sins because you're not getting the jurisdiction from somebody else. You're getting it directly from the church for the purpose of hearing the confession of this particular penitent. And so any sins that penitent confesses, you have jurisdiction over, and you can give absolution for all those sins if you judge the penitent is repentant and is going to make restitution or whatever else is required. So that's the jurisdiction we had. So that was supplied jurisdiction, and that was because of the state of necessity. But what happens now, they made a deal on jurisdiction, and it was the year of mercy. What year was that? The year of mercy? Pope Francis's Year of Mercy. Anyway, it was a few years ago now, and he gave jurisdiction to all the priests of the Society of St. Pius X. Now, at first it was just for the Year of Mercy, but then when the Year of Mercy ended, he extended it indefinitely into the future. So now all the priests of the Society of St. Pius X have jurisdiction directly from Pope Francis. So it's, again, not through any hierarchy. So it's not through Bishop Fillet, it's not through the Superior General of the Society of St. Pius X, it's not through anybody like that, it's directly from the Pope. Now this is a question that I don't have the answer for, because only the Church could answer this question probably, but there's a principle in philosophy that nemo dat quo non habet. No one gives what he does not have. So if I don't have something, I can't give it to you. That's very common sense, really, isn't it? You don't come and ask me for something I don't have, or maybe you might ask me for something I don't have, and then I say, sorry, I don't have it. I can't give it to you. You come and ask me for $1 million, and I say, well, I'd like to help you, but you know, my wallet's not that thick, so I can't give it to you. And that's the principle, and that's true. Now the Pope has himself said publicly that he cannot judge cases of certain sins of immorality against the Sixth Commandment, where he said that publicly. Who am I to judge, was his expression, for a particular type of sin. It's a very, very bad sin, and he said he can't judge that it's a sin. So can he give jurisdiction to the priests of the society to judge that's a sin? That's a very good question. That's a question I ask, and I think, well, how can he? If he can't judge it himself, how can he give authority to judge it to the priests of the society? Likewise, there was a case in Argentina where a woman was an adulteress. She was living with a man that was not her husband, and the priest rightly said, well, you cannot come to Holy Communion because you are living in sin. And she didn't like to be told she was living in sin, and so she contacted Pope Francis. Maybe she knew him from when he was in Argentina anyway, I don't know, but she contacted him, and he told her no, she could go to Holy Communion. So it seems like he cannot judge sins of adultery and say that they are sins, and say that they exclude you from that. So somebody living in sin, what they were always called living in sin, can now be going to Holy Communion. So can he give authority then to the society to judge sins of adultery? That's because if he can't judge them himself and say this is a sin, and he overruled that priest who did judge it was a sin, so he got overruled. So would he also overrule any priest of the society that said this is a sin and you can't go to communion to somebody that was living in sin? It seems he would. So it seems like their jurisdiction is limited. Also, he doesn't judge heresy as a sin. He put a statue of Martin Luther in the Vatican, and was pleased to do that. And so he doesn't judge that's a sin. So the jurisdiction that he has is very limited. And so he can only give very limited jurisdiction to the priests of the society. So it's very possible that if you didn't like what the priests of the society said to you in confession, you could write a letter to the Pope, and the Pope would overrule him and say, sorry, he cannot say that. He cannot judge that in that manner. And I don't know why that could not happen. So they're now dependent. So now the Church for confessions is dependent upon the Romans, the conciliarists, who are modernists, who don't have a proper idea of morality, who don't have a proper idea of offenses against God, the honor due to God, and how God is offended by sin, don't have a proper idea of the Ten Commandments and what they command and what they forbid. And so we're dependent, now the society priests are dependent upon them for jurisdiction. And so that's, they're no longer independent, they no longer have supplied jurisdiction. They surrendered that and said, we're going to accept this jurisdiction from Pope Francis, we're going to be very grateful for it. And Father Linné says we now have ordinary jurisdiction. That's not ordinary jurisdiction. That's not, ordinary jurisdiction comes from the ordinary of the diocese. So they don't have ordinary jurisdiction, they have a special category of jurisdiction just for the priests of the Society of St. Pius X, where to get it directly from the Pope. And one other thing about confessions Bishop Fillet, when he was Superior General, before he got this jurisdiction from the Pope, he claimed some kind of ordinary jurisdiction because he put in reserved sins. He reserved sins as if we were getting this jurisdiction to hear confession from him. So he made a certain class of sins. He said you have to, if somebody confesses one of these sins, like an abortion was an example, you have to have recourse to the district superior. You cannot give absolution. And there were other types of sins you had to have recourse to Menzingen. You cannot give absolution without permission from Menzingen. So if somebody confesses this sin, you got to say, wait a minute, now come back next week, and then you got to call up Menzingen and say, what should I do in the case of this sin? What penance should I give? And they say, give this penance and give absolution, perhaps. If they thought you were sin. But that was totally illegal. Why was that illegal? Because the jurisdiction did not come through the district superior, the jurisdiction did not come through Menzingen, it did not come from Bishop Fillet, it came directly from the church. So with supplied jurisdiction there could be no reserved sins. So Bishop Fillet, when he put these rules in for the priests of the society, he was claiming some kind of jurisdiction that he didn't have, and that pretending that the priests of the society were getting jurisdiction through him. Now the only way that could be legitimate is if he made a secret deal with Rome, and they said, yes, you have jurisdiction for the society, but he never publicly said that, and so a priest had to reject that. And when he was questioned on this, he said, well, we have to have order. We have to have order. Is that possible?
No,
No, why not?
because they're not in an ordinary state of jurisdiction. They're
That's
in
right.
an emergency state.
Yeah, so we have chaos. The only way you can have order is you have an ordinary. If you don't have an ordinary, you don't have order, because only the ordinary can put order in. And we didn't have an ordinary. We weren't under the order. We refused to be under the ordinaries of the dioceses because they were modernists and liberal, and they were not putting proper order in the diocese. They were corrupting the diocese. They were destroying the order that had been in the diocese when they took over, and they were corrupting it. So we could not be under them. We could not be dependent upon them. And so that was, any priest that did have recourse to the district superior or to Menzingen was in danger of, or it seems to be, he could be accused of violating the single seal of the confessional, because you're speaking about something that happened in the confessional to somebody that has no authority over it. Whereas in the ordinary case, your superior, the parish priest or the bishop, would have jurisdiction over that case, and you would not be violating the seal of the confession by going to him. But if you go to somebody that has no jurisdiction, like your district superior, has no authority, because you only get jurisdiction directly for that penitent when that penitent comes. And so that penitent didn't go to the district superior. Maybe they didn't like the district superior. Maybe they did go to the district superior. He refused them absolution, said, "Oh, I'll find somebody more lenient," and they went to some other priest. Who knows? I don't know. But anyway, they're not in under the jurisdiction of the district superior right now, because as soon as they leave the confessional, then the priest has no longer jurisdiction over them. They go, they're out. So he only has jurisdiction to hear a priest that they confess, the sins that they confess in the confessional. That's how it is with supplied jurisdiction. But it made us independent we were dependent upon the church, but we weren't dependent upon the modernists and the conciliarists that are running the church. So that was jurisdiction. And the same for marriages now. They put themselves and made themselves dependent upon the local bishop for marriages. And they might say, we don't have any Novus Ordo priests coming in here to do weddings, but they're sending all the paperwork to the local bishop. And Father Wegner in the United States now, he said he made deals with 40 bishops for marriages. He probably made more since then, maybe. But 40 dioceses, he has delegation to delegate a priest to the society to do a marriage, and then they send all the paperwork to that bishop, and that bishop has authority over that marriage. And that means they're dependent upon that bishop, and the Conciliar Church has corrupted marriage. You know, they allow divorce. They call it annulments, but effectively it's divorce, and because it's not an annulment, you can't nullify something that was valid. You know? A valid marriage cannot be made null. Null and void means it never happened. And so, but they call it an annulment, but they give a divorce, and they say, okay, you're divorced, you can go marry somebody else now. You're free to marry somebody else. But our Lord had said, what God has joined together, no man can set asunder, and that includes the Romans. They can't break a valid marriage. That's why, you know, the Pope would have liked to honor Henry VIII, King Henry VIII's request. He would have liked to, for the sake of the good of Europe and the good of the world and everything, and let him have a divorce, but he could not do it because he had no authority to do it. So Henry VIII had to stay married to his first wife, and he could not go take another wife. And the Pope had to tell him that. Sorry, I have no authority to say you can go have another wife. And the Church has always had to say that, because the Church has no authority. Once somebody's married, they have no authority to say you're not married. But now they do that in the Conciliar Church. They took that from the Protestants. The Protestants introduced divorce. Well, Henry VIII introduced divorce into what had been Christendom, and then the Protestants have adopted it everywhere, I think. And so now the Conciliar Church has adopted it, but they don't call it divorce, they call it annulment. And so now the marriages in the society are dependent upon these local bishops, and if somebody's not happy in their marriage, I'm sure they can ring up the bishop and say, look, I want an annulment, and they'll say, okay, we'll get you one, and you have to pay a fee for those, I think. You have to pay the fee, but they'll get you one, and they'll get you the annulment. So they're dependent upon these conciliarists, and they cannot keep the faith that way. And so they want to have some kind of place in the Church. They want to be recognized by the Church, they say. And they are recognized now for confessions, and they're recognized now for matrimony, so they're getting this recognition they want. And they want some kind of assurance that they'll be autonomous, that they'll be able to govern their own territory, and guarantees and all this. But the guarantees will come from people who are not very honest. They gave some of the organizations that joined the Ecclesia Dei Commission were given guarantees, and then later on they were told, well, we want you to do this, we want you to do this, guarantees they could be traditional. And then they said, well, we want you to follow the new code of canon law, we want you to say eventually the new Mass. So that's what happens to them. And so the guarantees are no good. And the guarantees Dom Gerard got when he joined Rome, when he separated himself from Archbishop Lefebvre and joined Rome in 1988, were no good. And so he became a modernist, and the organization got into the conciliarism, and now they're no longer a truly traditional monastery. So that's the case of the society. It was way back in 1974. This was before Archbishop Lefebvre was even suspended. He was still in good standing with the Church in 1974. The Society of St. Pius X was in good standing with the Church in 1974. And he was saying, we have to do what we're doing until such a time as that the true light of tradition dissipates the darkness obscuring the sky of eternal Rome. So already he says we cannot be under the Romans, even though we were officially under the Romans at that time, because the Society of St. Pius X was erected lawfully within the Modernist Church. It was lawfully erected and made a pious union within the Modernist Church. That's the way Archbishop Lefebvre had a bishop friend who was a traditional minded, and was traditional, and he agreed to set up the Society of St. Pius X in Icone, and that's where it got set up, and that's what happened. So then the changes have been coming in ever since then. So the 2012 General Chapter, and we're jumping ahead, the 2012 General Chapter was the one that dropped the agreement that there would be no practical agreement without a doctrinal agreement. So they had doctrinal discussions for many years. I forget the year period, but for many years they had these doctrinal discussions. And Bishop Fillet promised, before these discussions started, he said everything will be audio recorded and everything will be video recorded and will be all published. Well, whether it was audio recorded or video recorded or not, we don't know, because it was certainly never published. So none of these discussions were published. Probably they, but I'm sure they do have these recordings somewhere. And probably the Romans have recordings, and probably the Society has recordings of these discussions, but they were never published. And I would suspect the reason they were never published was because so the faithful could not see how far the conciliars were different from the Catholic faith, how they did not have the Catholic faith at all, because they could come to no agreement on anything. They couldn't make an agreement, they couldn't find common ground like they did with the Lutherans, they couldn't find common ground with the Society of St. Pius X. So they had to break off these agreements, these discussions, and already just to have such discussions is already wrong, because the Catholic Church's mission is to teach. Our Lord gave them the mission, go out and teach all nations. He who believes and is baptized will be saved. He who does not believe will be condemned. That was what our Lord said. And St. Paul didn't go around to the people in Rome that were worshiping false gods and say, oh, what do you believe? What do you believe? What do you think about this? What are your beliefs? No, he didn't dialogue with them. He didn't care what they believed. He knew they were believing errors, and he was there to tell them the truth and teach them the truth. And that's what the Catholic Church has always done. So you don't dialogue about doctrine, because doctrine is set in stone. Once the Church says something, it cannot be changed. And that's an absolute truth, and it's truth for all time. So there's nothing about doctrine of the Church that can be dialogued about and discussed and debated. And we just go out and teach. We don't debate. We don't have debates with Protestants and stuff. We say, you Protestants, we're teaching here. If you want to come and listen, you can come and listen. If you run away, you don't want to hear, well then you don't have to hear. But we don't discuss. So the whole idea of having doctrinal discussions is opposed to the mission of the Church already. And so they wanted to have these doctrinal discussions to think if they could find some common ground. They could not find any common ground. So they changed tactics then, and they said, well, we're outside the Church, and we have to get inside. We're outside, we have to get inside. That was, and then in the meantime, Father Schmidberger also converted around to this way of thinking. He saw the way the wind was blowing in society, and he went with the wind. And so he, like I said, when he was Superior General, there were no problems, but now he's on the side that wants to come to some kind of a political agreement with the Romans. And so they said we have to be recognized. And they came up with this idea that the Church is visible, and we're not in the visible Church.
It would be an act of justice, in fact, to be just reintegrated in a more visible way in the Church. That's all we are talking about here.
Now, the Church has 4 marks. 1, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Visible is not a mark of the Church. It's not something that we can join and say, there's the true Church. So they never said it was the true Church. They said it was the visible Church, and that we're outside and we want to get inside. We want to be recognized. We don't like being outside. We're not comfortable being outside. It's not right to be outside. We have to get back inside. And this became the argument that they spoke to the faithful, and kept marking on the visible Church. So they wanted to get inside. So in 2012, they dropped the idea that we had to firstly have a doctrinal agreement, because they couldn't come to a doctrinal agreement, because the doctrine of the conciliarists was not Catholic, and still the Society had basically Catholic doctrine. So they could not agree on the doctrine. So they said, well, we don't need a doctrinal agreement. We'll just strictly look for some kind of political agreement, some kind of working arrangement where we can be recognized. And that became the word then, to be recognized. And it did not also exclude the oath of Cardinal Ratzinger, the profession of faith of Cardinal Ratzinger. Cardinal Ratzinger came up with a new profession of faith, I think in 2000, and the General Chapter did not exclude that one. So, and the Superior General implicitly accepted it in a footnote in his own doctrinal declaration, Bishop Fillet's doctrinal declaration. He implicitly accepted that they would accept Cardinal Ratzinger's oath of faith, oath and profession of faith, which are against the anti-modernist oath. So the society priests, if they accepted that, they would have to perjure themselves. Just like all the bishops at the Vatican Council perjured themselves by accepting religious liberty and the other errors that they had taken an oath against. By accepting this modernism, they perjured themselves, those bishops. Perjury is a sin against which commandment? That's the second commandment, right? Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Perjury is a sin against that. So, anyway, so they perjure themselves, and we'd have to perjure ourselves to accept this new oath of Cardinal Ratzinger, because we've taken the oath against modernism. And so once you take an oath, you take it for, you don't repeal it and say, well, Lord, I'm repealing that oath now. I'm going back. So that's what they did. So that's the story. So in 2018, Father Pagliani told the priests that they should make, in their speech, they should use words like normalization, recognition, a solution of our, or modification of our canonical status, or renewal of our canonical approval, words like this and language like this when talking to the faithful, that this is what we're seeking. They didn't say seek an agreement, because they weren't going to get an agreement. And so there's not going to be an agreement, there's just going to be a merging, a coming together, and it's in 2018, they also said, it's the right of the Superior General to decide if it is expedient to have contact with the Holy See. It is up to him in prudence and under the guidance of, dictated by divine prudence, to take into condition a modification of the state. So to modify our current state with the Romans, it's up to the Superior General. So they've bypassed the General Council and bypassed the what's that called? When they have all the priests get together, all the superiors? The general chapter. Bypassed the general chapter and said now the Superior General is now the superior dictator, and he has to alone decide whether we make some kind of contact with Rome. And that's something new now. And so there's some other things they've said that are wrong too. Even in this statement it said dictated by divine providence. Now how do we know that the Superior General is going to follow divine providence?
He has the state of grace, Father. He can't possibly err.
Yeah, this is this lie about the state of grace. See, this is
Grace of state.
grace of state. Grace of state. Yes, grace of state. That's a great error that the priests of the society have been publishing. Many priests have said this. The Superior General has the grace of state, and so that he can decide, and he has the one that gets the grace to do it, and we don't get that grace to judge it. So we cannot judge what he says, and we cannot murmur. And if we murmur about it and we say, well, he's doing wrong, then there's going to be no Father Pagliani now says, if you talk like that, there's going to be no vocations from your family, because vocations don't come from families where so you criticize priests or bishops or anything, so that would presumably mean the Novus Ordo priests and Novus Ordo bishops too, that you're not going to get any vocations from your family. So that's something Father Pagliani has said recently. They don't come from those type of families where there's criticisms of religious and priests and stuff like this. So there won't be any vocation. So I think we've talked about that grace of state before. Haven't we explained that before? There's only two types of grace: sanctifying grace and actual grace. Actual grace is for action. Sanctifying grace is for being. It changes how you are. Sanctifying grace changes you from being a sinner to being a good man. You are just. You are holy. You are sanctified by sanctifying grace. It's also called habitual grace. It's something you have. You have that grace. Actual graces, you don't have those. They're not havable. They're not something you can have. They are for acting right now. So God offers you a grace. You're getting a temptation. God offers you a grace to resist the temptation. And you're driving past MacDonald's and you smell it, and you're hungry, and you know it's Friday, and God gives you a grace, and you say, well, I'll just turn in and get I'll just get a coffee, and so you pull in anyway, and then you end up making a mistake and ordering a burger or a Big Mac or something too, and then you eat it because you rejected the grace. You just keep driving past McDonald's, so you rejected that grace. So actual graces you can accept or reject. If you accept them, they become efficacious. They have a good effect, and you do something pleasing to God, or you don't do something that's displeasing to God. So He gives you the grace not to do something displeasing to Him, or the grace to do something pleasing to Him. You're walking by the chapel and you get a grace and say, oh, I could stop in and make a visit to the Blessed Sacrament. So maybe you do, maybe you don't. So if you do, you accepted that grace. That was a grace from God that gave you that idea to say, maybe I could make a visit to the Blessed Sacrament. And you accept it, and so you go in and make a genuflection and make a little visit with our Lord. Or you reject it and just keep walking past. So that's how we get with actual graces. So they're not something you have, they're something you accept or reject. And it's just totally contradictory with the whole position of the society to say that the Superior General has the grace of state. Because if that was the case, well then Pope John Paul II would have had the grace of a much higher state, and we should have just followed everything he said. Because we say, well, Pope John Paul has the grace of state, and so we have to do whatever he says. But we said, no, we can't do what he's saying because we can see that that's wrong. And so we can't follow Pope John Paul because he's telling us wrong. Well, we can do the same thing with Bishop Fillet, and we can do the same thing with Father Pagliariani. We can say, well, you don't have the grace of state because it's not havable, and people reject graces all the time. Married people have the grace of state to love one another, to always get along, to have order and harmony in their family, to always do what is correct for their children, and raise their children well and discipline formally and in the right amount. But often they don't do that because they reject the grace of state, and so we don't always cooperate with the actual graces that come with our state. So grace of state is just really a right to actual graces to fulfill our duty. That God agrees, and His part of the agreement when we get in a particular state is to give us the graces we need to fulfill our duties in that state. So the Pope has a right to the graces he needs to govern the church well and convert the world. And he rejects those graces. And so the Pope rejects those. Everybody can reject graces, so there's no idea to say we have a grace of state. We are offered graces of state by God, and we maybe accept some, reject some, and we go on. But that's how it is. So the idea that the Pope, Bishop Fillet has grace of state is totally wrong, and all those priests that are saying that know that, because they've all studied the fact of grace, and they know, they've studied the treatise on grace, and they know about grace, and they know about actual grace and sanctifying grace, and so they know it's not true what they're saying. But when you start following modernism, well, then truth is the first victim, and truth goes by the wayside because modernism is a state of mind that denies there is objective truth, and says truth is what I want it to be. In modernism, what I want to be true is true, and that's exactly what modernism is in a nutshell. And so that's wrong. So that's the situation in society. Father Pagliariani is following the same path. Recently he wrote something good, but that's the whole. That's the work of the way you make these political agreements. You go one step forward, one step backward, and you keep moving generally in the one direction. But you have to take steps backward. You have to appease the people. They want to have to make sure everybody's following you. And what they're doing now is from the wisdom of Pope Benedict. Pope Benedict was Father Ratzinger during the council, and then he was Cardinal Ratzinger later, Bishop Ratzinger sometime in there, I guess, but Cardinal Ratzinger. And when he was implementing the council, and they were bringing in the new Mass and all this, they changed the Mass often. So already they had a new Mass in 1962, then they had another new Mass. It wasn't a new Mass, it was the same Mass, but a liberalization of the Mass in 1962, and then a liberalization of the Mass in 1964, and then a liberalization of the Mass in 1966. And see, after the 64 liberalization, that's when the traditional movement really began, where the ones that were wise and onto the things saw this is wrong. And so he had this, and then he had the 66, and then the 68. Well, I don't think there was a 68, and then in 69, there was no 68. In 69, they came out with the new Mass, and then they imposed it. They imposed it very quickly, and England got a special dispensation for a few years. Cardinal Haynen got him a special dispensation in England for a few years not to embrace the new Mass, but that didn't last long, and then it was imposed there as well. But it was imposed, and so the Catholic Mass was eliminated and made illegal, and said it was illegal and wrong, and we could no longer say this Mass, and it was forbidden, and it had been abrogated and all this. Later, Pope Cardinal Ratzinger or Pope Benedict, one of those two, said no, it was never abrogated, and any priest could say it. That's what he said later. But it was restrictions. You had to have approval of the bishop to do that. But that's what they did. But he said, well, we went too fast that time. And so I think he's learned his lesson, and that's why they're going slowly now. Everybody expects an agreement tomorrow, and then there is none. And then Bishop Fillet speaks like, oh yes, we're right there, and then nothing happens. And that's happened several times, and nothing happens. And because they don't want to lose people like they did in the first. They don't want another reaction like they had. They don't want a traditionalist movement again. They want to bring everybody with them, so they're going to go slowly, very slowly, and just make little changes here and there, and bring things into line with the Romans. So there's all these changes, but there's other little changes going on in different localities, different places, slowly bringing in new stuff and everything. And some things you say, well, they're minor, and yes, they are minor. But I remember back in the 90s, the late 90s, or maybe the early 90s, but the early 90s, we had a priest meeting in Winona. And Father James Doran gave us a talk on the ciborium veil, because the ciborium veil was considered important in the society. The Modernists eliminated the ciborium veil, of course, and they eliminated the tabernacle veil. They eliminated all veils. They don't like veils. Women's veils they eliminated. So on the ciborium veil, and he was telling us, I remember this clearly, that there's two. He didn't use the word complementary, but that'd be the correct word. Two complementary rules. One is that the ciborium is always veiled, and another rule says the ciborium is veiled when it has the Blessed Sacrament in it. So I remember Father Charles Ward was there, and Father Ward said, solution. You put the veil halfway on when the Blessed Sacrament's not in there and it's on the altar, and then when it is in there, you put it on fully. That's what Father Charles Ward said. I remember that very clearly. And Father James Doran said, that's not a solution, that's a compromise. And that's what Father Doran said. But that was how the ciborium veil was considered to be important. Of course, you can use Father Ward's solution, or you can just put it on and then do like you do for the monstrance when you put the ciborium on the corporal, take it off, and then do like that. But anyway, that it was considered important. But then I was a deacon for a pontifical ordination mass at Holy Cross Seminary in Australia in about 2000 and something, maybe 2005, I don't know, whatever. I was a deacon. And the deacon's job in a pontifical mass is after the consecration of the host, before the consecration of the wine. he stands up. Before that, he takes all the lids off all the ciboria. There's more than one often at a pontifical mass because there's lots of people there and lots of priests are going to give out communion. So in this case, there were 4 ciboria. I remember it clearly, and I had taken all the lids off them and the tops off. And so after the consecration of the host, the deacon is supposed to put the lids back on, and then put the veil on the ciboria. Each veil on each one of them, because now they have the Blessed Sacrament in the ciboria. And the sacristan had dutifully laid out all the 4 veils there. They were all there, laid out by the sacristan, whoever the sacristan was, but that was the rules we followed then. And Bishop Fillet stopped me when I was going to put the veils on. He wouldn't let me put the veils on the ciborium. He wanted to leave them unveiled, even though they got the Blessed Sacrament on them. And I don't think he ever said anything, but just by his example, now they don't use the veil on the ciboria in a lot of places. Some of the older priests still do, but in a lot of places they don't veil the ciboria anymore because Bishop Fillet doesn't do it, and that's the power of example. And Icone, a priest that went to Icone, told me, what's the point in putting the veil on, because you're just going to take it off again in a few minutes anyway. Well, that's true. But the reason we put it on is because now the Blessed Sacrament's in there to honor the Blessed Sacrament, to honor our Lord in the Ciboria. But that's what they're learning at Icone now. Why put it on? Because and that's exactly what the Modernists were saying when they got rid of it back in the 60s. So they're following the same program of the Modernists. And then Father Vincente Griego, you might have heard of him. He's an American from Albuquerque, New Mexico. He became rector of Holy Cross Seminary in Australia. And he taught the seminarians for the Corpus Christi procession what he learned in the seminary, because I know what he learned in the seminary, and he learned how to be a thurifer. But the thurifers, you have 2 thurifers for a Corpus Christi procession, and you take turns turning around and incensing the Blessed Sacrament, and then you turn back, and then the other one turns around. And so one of you is always incensing the Blessed Sacrament for the whole Corpus Christi procession. You got somebody there with the boats, so you can get more incense. If you need more incense, somebody puts incense in your thurible for you. The other one incenses. You don't do it at the same time, but so you get trained to do that. And that's what he learned in the seminary. But he taught the seminarians in the Corpus Christi procession. The thurifers just walk. They don't face the Blessed Sacrament. They walk in front and just swing their thuribles like this. And they don't incense the Blessed Sacrament at all. And so you don't really need a thurifer if you're not going to incense the Blessed Sacrament. But anyway, that's what he taught the seminarians. And so that's something new. And so I questioned him on that. And he said, well, that's the rubric. So the rubrics are the rules for how to do things. So I don't know what rubric that is, but that's not the one he learned in the seminary, I'll tell you that. So he can never say what Archbishop Lefebvre said, tradidi quod accepi. I handed down what I received, because he handed down something that he did receive. He handed down something that he got from somewhere else. So that's, that's not so small as the tabernacle veil. That's a little bit bigger, because incense has always been offered to gods. The pagans offered incense to their gods, and the kings were the first ones to offer incense to our Lord, recognizing that he was a god. And now the society is not offering incense. Well, they probably still do a benediction. I'm not going to say they never do, but the priests coming out of Holy Cross Seminary are taught not to have the Blessed Sacrament incense during Corpus Christi processions. Now, I don't know if they're doing that in Winona, in this other seminary, Virginia, or not, but that's what they're doing and that's what they were doing when Father Griego was superior. And I doubt that Father Thiemann changed that and went back to tradition on that. I doubt very much that Father Thiemann did that, but anyway, that's what he was teaching there. So they're bringing in just different little changes here and there to make it more modern, more liberal, and less Catholic in every way. And these changes people get used to them. And the same with the dress code. The dress code has gone way down in many parishes of the society. I know in Brisbane, when I was there, I preached about the dress code quite often. And for 2 years, I told the men they had to wear a jacket and tie to Sunday Mass. And, Brisbane, it gets hot. It's tropical. Well, it's not tropical, it's subtropical, but it does get hot. And we didn't have air conditioning in the church or anything like that. But I said, well, you have to wear a jacket and tie to Sunday Mass. That's proper respect for Sunday Mass, that's a normal thing. And then after saying that for 2 years, I felt I can now say something to the women. So, because then they can't complain. Because now most of the men were wearing jackets and ties to Sunday Mass. And so all the men were wearing jackets and ties to Sunday Mass. And they were sweating when it was hot, because you get hot and sweat when you got a jacket and tie on. But that's what they were doing. And they were wearing jackets and ties. And I told the women that they had to dress properly. And, I remember they were having this one thing. It was a parish fete or dinner or something like this. And in the announcements it said there's going to be for the ladies a best dressed contest or something like this. So when they actually got up to the parish fete, the woman in charge of it said, well, we were going to have a best dressed contest, but Father MacDonald changed it to a most dressed contest. So that's what she said, because I had to preach about that then. So, but anyway, but now I see in Brisbane, I see them coming out. The men aren't wearing jackets and ties anymore. So that's gone by the wayside because they're liberalizing the. I'm not going to say the women aren't dressing correctly because I haven't done examine them, but I can see the guys out there and they don't have their jackets and ties on, and so they're liberalizing things in the parishes, and the morality is going down. And they're bringing in movies. And, like I said, in New Zealand, they brought in at the parish fete. Now they have photo shoots with Darth Vader, Batman, and Superman. And we tell them not to go to have movies in the house, and not to watch movies. And hopefully, the little children wouldn't even know who Darth Vader was. And maybe Superman. It's hard to not know who Batman is, maybe, or Superman, but Darth Vader. But now they bring them to the things. And so St. Anthony's parish didn't have St. Anthony there, but they had Darth Vader, and bringing in all this worldly spirit. And Father Cranshaw said, well, we did that because we don't want people to think we're a cult.
Ato pa, ang tao karon magsulti usahay na ang misa sa Latin mo kulto. O ang parish sa Sutana mo kulto tungod sa 50 ka tuig na. Ang mga Katoliko nawala na nila ang mga batasan sa una.
We don't want to be considered a cult. We want to be considered a normal religion, and this is why we want this normalization with Rome. So I just got one last thing here because it's getting long. I think I don't know how long it's been, but I think it's getting long. In this book, somebody moved my bookmark. So where is it? Yes, page 377. This is the book Christian Warfare, published by the Society of St. Pius X. It has the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius in it. And St. Ignatius says, for the standard of Christ, that there are 3 steps. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but for 3 steps. First, poverty is opposed to riches. The second, insults or contempt as opposed to the honor of this world. The third, humility as opposed to pride. So the second step, insults or contempt. Now see, we don't want to be contemned by the world. We want to be not considered a cult. We want to be considered to be normal by worldly people. That's what they're saying. And this is what Father Schmidberger and Bishop Fillet are saying. We want to be considered normal by the Romans, the modernists in Rome. We want to be normalized. We want them to think we're normal. We want to be normal according to their standards. We don't want to be abnormal. We don't want to be contemned by them as being some strange group or some strange sect, or we don't want to be called a sect, or we don't want to be called schismatic, or we don't want to be called all these names that are untrue, but we don't want to be called them. We want to be normalized. We want to be regularized. We want a solution to our situation. So we want to be in with them. We don't want to be have them have a bad opinion against them. And that goes against what they preach in the spiritual exercises, where it says we prefer the standard of Christ, poverty, being contemned or insulted, and then that leads to humility which is the source of all the virtues. Once you're humble, then God will give you virtues, and you get virtues. And so to get to humility, poverty, and contempt come first. But they don't want that contempt. They don't want to be outside. We want to be normal. We want to be considered normal. We don't want to be considered a cult or anything like that. And that's what they're saying now. That's the situation in society. So it's going slowly, and it's probably going to go very slowly, and there will probably never be a formal agreement for a long, long time, but there'll just be more and more merges and working together and working with the indulters and saying, well, you're kind of like us because we all have the Latin Mass, and working with these other ones and having joint things with them like they do in Brisbane. Brisbane's very advanced under Father Raymond Toke, so he's ready for all the latest things. So they have a joint youth group with the indulters, and they do weddings in the indult mass church sometimes, and they have meetings with the indulters, and they get together and all this. And so yes, that's they're not indulters actually. They're Christ the King or something like the oratory, whatever that is. They call it the oratory of Christ the King. But anyway, they're indulters, or Ecclesia Dei anyway. So that's what's happening in the society, and so that's why it's very dangerous to be a part of this. We get used to the bad dress. If we go to the Mass and we see everybody's dressing badly, we want to fit in. Then you get the idea, well, I got to be normal, so I got to dress like everybody else, and that happens. And so, if a man comes from a parish where they all wear jackets and ties, and he goes down to Texas or somewhere like this where they all wear blue jeans and cowboy hats, and cowboy boots to Mass, and he says, oh, I better get myself a pair of cowboy boots so I can fit in, and give up my jacket and tie, and get a Texan tie or whatever that is, and a Stetson, and try to fit in. That's what does happen. So that's the crisis in what's going on in the society. Any questions? Yes?
There was a 4-minute video of Bishop Fillet and Father Timothy Pfeiffer. They're in the Philippines, and Bishop Fillet stated a remark that the modernists accept us or something like that. Do you remember that one?
No.
Our situation now is the following. First, and these I can give you a statement from Rome, they say very clearly, the society is not schismatic. So we are Catholic, and the modern church does recognize us as Catholics. But they say there is something irregular, because they do not have a canonical status. And they do not want to give us this canonical status before we say that the new Mass is good and the Council is good. And we are not going to say it. So we are a little bit stuck here. But at the same time, you heard that, I'm sure you did hear that the Pope did give us the power to confess. And everybody can come to us, not only our faithful, everybody. And the priest has the power to give the confession. It is true also for the last rites. It is for the extreme unction. And recently, we have also, on a curious way, the power for the marriages. It's even more than that. Just to show you that even if there are certain things which are not yet complete, on the other side, many things are already done, where Rome is accepting us as Catholics. How could this be if we are not Catholics? You see, here you have examples in the real life which shows you that they consider us as Catholics.
We were told to use that we want recognition. That's the terms we're supposed to use now when we talk to people.
Well, I think first of all, must make it clear that Bishop Follet is not really looking for an agreement. Rome is proposing a regularization of the society. So the term agreement is confusing. It's not clear. It's too vague. An agreement would be maybe on doctrine, which is not the case. But a recognition of the society, that's what we are talking about today.
Talk to people. Yeah. So we're looking for recognition. So they've already got recognition, we're saying. So they got some recognition. They certainly do have some recognition, but they don't have full recognition. They're not fully into the club.
Yeah.
And so the club is like the Freemasonic thing.
Auch sehen, das Wirkende, vor allem aber in der Kirche erkennen. Es ist recht interessant zu merken, in 92 hat ein hoher Freimaurer aus Mexiko behaupten können, im Vatikan selbst wirken jetzt 4 Logen. Sie sind vom skotischen Ritus, aber das sind Speziallogen für die Prälaten vom Vatikan, des Vatikanes. Also die geheimen Brüder arbeiten zur Zerstörung nicht nur von außen, sondern sogar in der Kirche selbst.
You know, the Freemasons, you can believe whatever you want. You can have any religion, that's what they tell you. You can have any religion you want, as long as you respect the other religions and all this. And, you know, the Conciliar Church has a wide breadth of beliefs in it. So some people believe in transubstantiation. Some people have never heard of transubstantiation, wouldn't know what it was, but they have a wide range of beliefs. This is just like the Anglicans. You know, Anglicans have the high church and the low church, and some believe more and some believe less. And this is how it is in the Conciliar Church now. They got a wide range of beliefs, and so yes, if they can find room for our range of beliefs in there, will be another pebble on the beach and fit in. Yes.
When Father Rostan was the district superior for the U.S.,
Yes.
I remember listening to an audio where he was talking to a congregation or something, and he was talking about a gentleman who was criticizing Bishop Follet on his internet blog, and he told this fellow that he has to take down his blog and he can't criticize Bishop Follet, and the fellow wouldn't listen, so he didn't distribute Holy Communion to this guy when he came up when he came to the communion rail on Sunday.
Well,
And then afterwards, everybody started clapping when they heard that.
On what grounds would a layperson be denied communion vis-a-vis their position on agreement? Would just voicing, say, on an internet forum or in a conversation in the parish hall that they're uneasy about this be grounds for being denied?
I mean, if you are worried that I'm not going to excommunicate everybody, I think I have allowed one case today in the East. That person has received letters asking to remove to even close its website. So it's, if you are worried, you'll receive letters before. You'll have time to because it's the canon law. Don't think that I enjoy doing these kind of things. I don't. But I will not let people play 2 games. On one hand, attack us. On the other hand, play angels at the communion rail. I told that person who I told that one person to whom I decided to refuse communion that it's inconsistency in their even thinking to have a website where you explain that Bishop Follet has made a new religion and still come to our church. This is a church of Bishop Follet. So if the words have a meaning, either Bishop Follet has a new religion and then get out. Please don't stay in a new religion if we are not Catholic anymore, if we are not defending, just go out of here. And so on one hand saying Bishop Follet has started a new religion, and on the other hand come and want from the priest of Bishop Follet to receive the sacrament. It just doesn't make any sense to me. So it's this kind of situation that eventually lead to that, you can talk to the priest about these things. You don't need to talk about and these persons make public on a website that their position are in opposition to our position. So
the thing in the society now is they've raised obedience to the superior and obedience to the society up to we have to just give this blind obedience to whatever comes from Menzingen, you know, and that's what they're claiming, and that's what they're teaching the priests, and that's what they're teaching the people. We just have to follow Menzingen because they got the grace of state. We don't have this grace of state. They can say something, and if we don't understand it, well, we got to get re-educated and discern better, or learn how to discern better, so that we can see that yes, this is the way to go. And that's in the old days, the society published a leaflet on obedience. Because why weren't we obeying Pope John Paul and everything he said? Why weren't we obeying Pope, maybe it was even before John Paul, Pope Paul VI? I think it was under Pope John Paul came out. This one, obedience, and showing that you can sin against obedience by excessive obedience or by too little obedience, whatever the opposite of that is, a defect in obedience. So by not doing what you're told, that's a sin against obedience. But by not doing something you're told that's wrong, that's not a sin against obedience, it's a sin to do it. It's a sin to do something wrong if you're told. And they had some pictures and some examples, and it was a nice leaflet. I think Bishop Williamson made it, and showing that obedience is in a virtue that admits of more or less. You know, you've got to stand in the middle for obedience. It's not like faith. You cannot have too much faith. You cannot have too much hope. You cannot have too much charity. But you can have too much obedience if you obey when you're told to do something wrong. Mm-hmm. So if your father says, I'm upset with the neighbor, go throw a rock through his window. And you say, yes, Dad, and you run over and throw a rock through his window. You're going to, instead of saying, no, Dad, that would be wrong. I know I'm not supposed to throw a rock through my neighbor's window. I can't do that. So that would be a sin against obedience if you go throw the rock through the window and you say, well, I'm just doing what I was told. This is what the whole world has recognized this now. This is what they had in the war crimes trials, you know. And the soldier said, well, I was just obeying orders. And they said, well, you're guilty. I was just obeying orders. I was doing what, and soldiers are taught to obey orders. You obey order or you get in trouble. And now they said, well, you were just obeying orders, but you're guilty of committing this war crime. That's what they decided in the Nuremberg trials and all this. And the whole world decided that if you obey something wrong, that you're guilty. And that's true. It is true. And if you obey something wrong, and that's what. But now the society says, no, you just have to obey, and you have to trust the superior general, and you have to have this thing in the superior general. And that's so they make obedience, exaggerated obedience, which is a sin. Exaggerated obedience is a sin. They make that the greatest thing now, and we have to follow. Any other questions? All right. Well, Lebate.
Nicht direkt beweisen. Aber ich glaube schon, dass diese Akten, diese Taten zu einem Plan gehören. Ein Plan, der ziemlich früh, mindestens Anfang dieses Jahrhunderts, wenn nicht ein bisschen früher, gemacht worden ist, und nämlich der Errichtung einer Weltregierung mit einer Weltreligion. Und das gehört sicher zu der Vorbereitung dieser Superreligion. Es ist schlicht und einfach nicht mit der katholischen Religion und deren Haltung zu vereinbaren.